Welcome to this edition of Diligence Inside America's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter, and I'll be your host for today's show. Today, we're going to talk about the board oversight process, public response to social issues. And joining me is someone I had on the show before and a great source of knowledge for us. And that's Paul Washington, who's the Executive Director of the Environmental, Social, and Governance Center with the Conference Board. Welcome, Paul.
Thanks. Great to be with you, TK.
So 2 things before we get started on this important topic. One is that this will be a 2-part series. And in the first part, Paul and I are going to talk about public response to social issues. And on the second part, which seems appropriate, we're going to talk about response to political issues. So with this first part, I also want to tell our audience, Paul, that the center has created a great executive summary white paper entitled Choosing Wisely: How Companies Can Make Decisions and a Difference on Social Issues, which I certainly recommend to our audience. And the link can be available in the website directorinsights.com in the show summary. So I certainly recommend that to everybody. And hopefully you'll have a chance to look at it. So to the topic at hand, Paul. So what criteria should boards and managements be using to determine if the corporation should take a position, and then if they should, to issue a public response?
Sure. It's a great question. And it's something that companies haven't necessarily had in place thus far, which is a clear set of criteria and a process for making decisions on social issues. For a lot of companies during the advent of Black Lives Matters last year, they were scrambling for a response. The head of communications would walk into the CEO's office virtually, because we were all online then, and sort of say, okay, we got to do something, right? And companies are being called on to address social issues so much more often now that they really need to have clear criteria and process. So some of the criteria we suggest companies consider are, first, is it consistent with your company's mission and your values? That's pretty broad. So you want to narrow it a bit. You want to say, all right, does it align with our business? Do we have business capabilities that are associated with addressing this issue? Is it something that we can have an impact on? Or are we just making a statement without making a difference? How will this be viewed by our various stakeholders? How does it link to our history and our traditions and our aspirations? How does it link to our ongoing sustainability, ESG, and corporate citizenship programs? Because you don't want to become this roving agency just putting out statements. You really want to make statements that are associated with action. And so those criteria help to narrow the field, I think, a little bit for companies to really focus on where they can make a difference and where it makes sense.
Those are great points. And we know when we talk about stakeholders, one of the most important stakeholders is the employees. Because you sure don't want to sort of upset the ranks, relative to taking positions that may sort of split your staff and, on 2 different sides on these issues. But I think your point is very well taken. The sort of tidal wave of social issues has really stressed the importance of making sure that there's some kind of process, some kind of plan. So, Paul, let's assume that after reviewing that criteria and looking at the stakeholders and the factors that come into play with making a statement to the public and taking a position, let's assume the answer is yes, it's something that we should do. So what would be sort of the best practice process for both developing and then issuing a public response?
Sure. I think a few things. First, let's start with the board's role in this. Boards generally haven't played a very strong role in overseeing companies' stance on social issues. This has largely been driven beneath the CEO and then by the CEO. The CEO makes the decision. So I actually think a best practice is to make sure that your board understands the criteria and the process you have in place. And even better yet, it's good to have a I don't like the word, but a proactive strategy for your approach to social issues, that this is what we stand for, and this is how we're going to carry out our views on this. And the board should oversee and maybe even improve that overall strategy. So I think that's an important role for the board. Once you've decided, yes, we do want to take a stand, I think it's really important to make sure a couple things: that you've canvassed enough perspectives from your internal working group, which hopefully you've got established, to vet these issues, and that you take their temperature on how best to phrase it. You really want to phrase the stances you're taking in a way that's both empathetic to the group or individuals who are most affected by it, but also inclusive, that doesn't alienate the 50% or 30% of your employee population and others who may disagree with it. So you don't want to use partisan terms. You don't want to use polarizing terms. You want to ground your response in a way that's inclusive, that's respectful, and that lets everyone know that this isn't a zero-sum game, that taking a position in this area is actually for the benefit of all. And then once as you're preparing to make a statement, be very conscious of how you're planning to follow through. Don't make a statement and then afterwards go to your corporate citizenship department and say, by the way, we're giving money to nonprofits. Or after you make your statement, you tell government relations, okay, now this is going on our lobbying agenda. You really have to make sure that you're prepared to act when you go out and speak.
Certainly, sometimes you make a statement by not responding, okay, which has to be thought through. And I really like your point about not surprising the board. That to me has always been a rule, that you don't want the board to be reading something in the newspaper that they were not aware of in any fashion. And Paul, if we can touch on that values just for a second too, hopefully companies have sort of outlined and made public the values that, again, they value most, and that the employees are well aware of that. But that sounds like a pretty important link to any time you're going to make a public statement that gets tied back to the corporation.
No, it certainly is. And one thing that we've seen is that companies have gone out and made statements without remembering that they have those statements of corporate values, without referencing them. And those are important touchstones to make it clear that this isn't something you just came to this morning or this afternoon or in response to the latest crisis. It's something that you've believed for a while. And frankly, basing your statement off those pre-existing values, grounding it in that, and hopefully that statement not only says what our values are, but how we bring them to life, it can buy you a little time. You could say, look, you know our values on this. This is our overall position. You can get out there and tell people that this issue matters to you, and it buys you a little time before you go out and then make the follow-up statement with, okay, and what are we doing about it? You don't want to wait too long on that, but you might want to take, we've seen you may want to take a few days or even a week or so to kind of get your thoughts together on how you're going to carry out your commitment.
When we talk about a process too, I would assume that means that it doesn't end just with issuing the statement. There needs to be some kind of tracking mechanism that sees how people and places are responding. I know that we recently saw a county in Georgia sort of revolt against Koch's position, on voting rights. Well, you're always going to have outliers in particular situations, but I think it's probably as important to keep track of what the sentiment is following any public position that companies take.
That's exactly right. And what we've seen is that consumer products goods companies tend to be pretty good at doing survey and other sort of work to measure the impact of the statements that they've made on retail consumers. But a lot of companies haven't been doing that. We point out in the report that there's a real opportunity here to measure the impact of your statement on your customers, on your employees, on your business partners, and on your regulators too. Like, how well is this playing with these different constituencies? This is not to say that you back away from your principled stance. If you believe it and stand by it, and backing away is a pretty risky thing to do. But it is good to know what impact you're having, what impact your statements are having on these different stakeholders.
Well, I want to, again, point everybody to diligentinsights.com, where there will be a link to the white paper, Choosing Wisely, How Companies Can Make Decisions and a Difference on Social Issues. It's a great paper done by the Conference Center. And Paul, I want to thank you again. I look forward to part 2 of this, where we'll be talking about political issues, which I could argue that may even be more sensitive sometimes than social issues.
They certainly can be. And I look forward to that too. Thanks, TK.
Well, thanks for joining us. And that will conclude this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again next week when we take another look at a critical topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. So we'll see you then.